Jim.
Mr. Wilson, is there in-season management data from DFO as the Fraser River sockeye salmon are swimming through Heiltsuk territory?
No.
Now, you had mentioned earlier to Ms. Gardner that perhaps there was data that Heiltsuk could provide to assist the other First Nations. Is there something that DFO can do to assist in that sort of data collection and delivery?
Well, they could provide a budget within the AFS agreement that would allow us to do, for example, test fishing out there, DNA studies, identify when a stock is going through, how many days it takes to go through. There's a number of opportunities that are there.
Is Heiltsuk experienced with test fishing?
Yes.
Can you explain what the experience is?
Well, it's with the larger seine boat. So you basically just go out and catch the salmon that are passing through.
Okay, now I'm going to move to consultation and FSC. Has Heiltsuk ever sought an increase in the FSC sockeye numbers in season?
Yes, last year.
Okay, can you tell us what happened last year?
When we found out the numbers that were hitting the Johnson Strait area were starting to climb, there was a discussion at our tribal council to engage in a nation-to-nation agreement. There was an opportunity for one of our membership who was fishing down in the Johnson Strait area to catch that fish and deliver it to the community. And there was a nation-to-nation agreement, and we caught 20,000 pieces, which was delivered to Bella Bella.
Did anything happen after that?
Yes. As soon as the numbers were heard, our urban members were asking that we would do the same. And so we engaged with DFO on the possibility of doing a similar arrangement. And it was at every turn that we talked to DFO, it was, no, if you wanted to get your allocation, it has to come out of Area 7 and 8, which is identified in the AFS agreement. But if we wanted to do another nation-to-nation agreement, the allocation that we caught would come off that host nation's allocation.
Okay, so just to back that up sequentially, when did you talk with DFO first?
It was after we received the fish from the Johnson Strait area.
Who did you talk to?
We talked to our resource manager, Kristen Wong.
Okay, and what did she tell you?
Those exact details of Area 7 and 8 and the nation-to-nation agreement on the allocation numbers.
And why didn't Heiltsuk talk to her before in relation to the First Nation-to-Nation agreement?
Well, it's when we understand that a nation-to-nation agreement is outside of the DFO AFS agreement, and they really don't have anything to do with it.
Okay, so after you talked to Ms. Wong, did you talk to anybody else at DFO?
Well, when we heard about the requirements for us to access an additional fish. I talked to Susan Anderson-Ben, who is the IMOG, basically she's the worker bee for IMOG. She connected us with Randy Bradnick and Greg Thomas, and also one of our urban council members, Jim White. Susan was also on the conversation as the note taker.
Okay, and who are Greg Thomas and Randy Bradnick?
Or DFO staff.
Okay, and who's Mr. White?
Again, an urban council member.
Okay, can you
for
recount?
the tribal council.
Sorry, could you recount to us the telephone discussion, please?
Well, basically, both Greg and Randy had identified the fact that we couldn't fish outside Area 7 and 8, and that if we did do a nation-to-nation agreement, the numbers that we would get would come off the host nation's allocation.
Do you remember anything else about that discussion?
The fact that they couldn't accommodate us because it's within a treaty process?
Did they explain to you what they meant by that?
No, they didn't.
Okay, now you just told us that someone was taking notes. Who was that?
Susan Anderson Ben?
Did you see the notes that she had taken?
Yes.
How soon after the discussion did you see those notes?
Shortly after.
And when you saw them, did you identify whether they were accurate or complete?
They were accurate but not complete.
Okay. Mr. Len, could you please pull up Health document 97? Mr. Wilson, can you take a look at this document and tell me if you recognize it?
Yes, I do.
What is it?
It's that conversation, the notes on the conversation I had with Mr. Jim White, Craig Thomas, and Randy Brannick.
Okay. Mr. Len, if you could go to the second page, please. I'm just going to ask you some questions, Mr. Wilson. At the top of that page, there's Greg Thomas's name, and then there's a colon, and then it reads, "We do not consider that Northern First Nations have any access to Fraser sockeye. The allocation that is listed for FSC in your communal license is stock and species specific. The basket of fish which Healthsick can have access to under the conditions of the communal license is defined by DFO." Do you remember him saying this or something to this effect during the telephone discussion?
Yes.
Okay, and do you agree with his statement?
No, that's not what it says in our AFS agreement.
Okay, and then next on the notes, there is the heading Randy Brannick, and underneath that it reads, "The Marine Area First Nations do not all have access to Fraser salmon for FSC. There's a total amount in the pre-season planning of 260,000 Fraser sockeye for use as FSC. That number cannot be changed in season, no matter how abundant the Fraser fish are." Do you remember Mr. Brannick saying that or something to that effect during the discussion?
Yes.
And did you agree with him?
No, we didn't.
Okay, and why is that?
Well, because that's not what it says within the IFMP and our AFS agreement.
Okay. Mr. Len, if you could pull up Exhibit 349, actually alongside would be great if you can manage that. And if we could go to page 76 of the 107 pages and look for paragraph 5.3. Thank you. So, Mr. Wilson, this is the IFMP North. Is there something in this IFMP North that tells you that the in-season communal license can be amended? Mr. Wilson, perhaps I can assist here. Okay, paragraph 5.3 reads communal license harvest targets. Can you see that on your screen?
I actually have the page. I just
Oh,
didn't
thank
have
you.
Yes.
Okay, so is there something on that page that tells you that communal licenses can be amended in season?
Well, the first paragraph, the last sentence says communal licenses can be amended in season for resource conservation purposes or to increase access for FSC purposes as needed.
Can we have this marked as the next exhibit, please, this IFMP?
Which document is that?
Oh, sorry, it is exhibited, I'm advised. Thank you.
I'm not sure your document 97 has been exhibited. It has not.
I'll come to exhibiting that. I'm coming back to that document right now. Thank you very much. Mr. Wilson, now I'd like to go back to these telephone notes and ask that Mr. Lung advance them to the next page. Now, the second person named from the top is Greg Thomas. And underneath that, it reads, "The allocation and the area for fishing for Healthsick are set. We have to work under the treaty guidelines. We are restricted by that policy. We have no option, no Fraser sockeye." Mr. Wilson, do you remember Mr. Thomas making this statement or something like it during the discussion on the telephone?
Yes.
Okay. And during that discussion, again, did he explain to you what he meant by the restrictions, either by policy or having to work under the treaty guidelines?
No.
And to your knowledge, being the director of the HERM, do you know what he's talking about?
No, I don't.
Okay, I'd ask that be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Referring to 97 now?
Exhibit 97, yes. Or
Healthsick 97.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir. That would be exhibit 1267.
Mr. Wilson, you had just told us that Ms. Anderson-Ben's notes are not complete, albeit accurate. Can you tell me what's missing?
There's a description of how we try to access our increased allocation through a nation-to-nation agreement. And we provided a newsletter to our urban members.
Mr. Lunn, if you can pull up HealthSIC 19, please, Exhibit 304. Mr. Wilson, do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
Is this the newsletter you're speaking of?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Lunn, if you could advance to the second page. I notice in paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4 that you would it indicates there, we contacted the 3 additional bands seeking a food fish permit, but each of these bands could not support our request because they had already caught their food fish allocation. Mr. Wilson, is that correct?
That's correct.
And when you contacted these bands, did they tell you what their understanding was of the allocation, or what I'll call the accounting rule? In other words, how the fish are counted if they're caught outside of a harvest of the management area in the AFSC?
All but one band indicated the same thing that would happen, that if I had accessed fish from their territory, that those numbers would come off their allocation. But the one band was of the understanding that if they caught their fish outside of their traditional territory, that allocation was to come off their own allocation.
Okay. After this, did DFO provide you with any further response or any written documentation explaining to you why they refused to agree to this out-of-management area fishing?
No.
And prior to agreeing to your AFS agreements, had you ever been advised of this particular rule, this out-of-management area fishing rule plus its accounting rule that comes with it?
No.
And from your perspective as a person that works at HERMD and has this level of experience of negotiating these AFS agreements and working in the marine environment, does that accounting rule make any sense to you?
No, it doesn't.
And why is that?
Well, ours is a need. We're required, well, not required, we have a membership that needs food fish. So, and it's not identified in the AFS or IFMP documents. So if we had a nation-to-nation agreement, we should have access to any additional fish through consultation process, not consultation process, but a negotiated process with DFO.
Okay, what about from a conservation perspective? Does that accounting rule make sense that the fish is counted against the host nation?
No, it doesn't.
And why is that?
I'm sorry, I'm misunderstanding your question.
Sorry, the accounting rule is that the fish, so if HealthSIC were permitted to catch fish outside of Area 7 and 8, the accounting rule you've been told by DFO is that those numbers would come off the host nation.
Yep.
Right. So from a conservation perspective of conserving Fraser River sockeye salmon, does that accounting rule make sense to HealthSIC?
Well, not of the fish are in conservation mode. Like the only reason we went after a nation-to-nation agreement last year was because of the number of fish that were passing by.
Okay, so it's not that there are too many fish, or sorry, that there are too little fish.
Yes.
Mr. Rosenberger earlier gave testimony today referencing this event in 2010, saying that there were some First Nations which endorsed HealthSIC fishing outside of its management area, and then I have it in my notes that he said there were other First Nations on the Fraser River who were against it. Are you aware of any First Nation that was against HealthSIC in 2010 fishing out of its management area in order to obtain that additional Fraser River sockeye salmon?
No, that's a surprise to me.
Okay, and I'm just going to turn very quickly to Mr. Rosenberger because maybe I just got my note wrong there. Mr. Rosenberger, you just heard my question to Mr. Wilson. What First Nation was that, or First Nations, that opposed HealthSIC fishing out of their territory?
The concerns, and this was discussed a fair amount this winter in the forum process, The Stolo raised concerns about the process, about who gets to make additional requests. The Upper Fraser Fisheries groups have made concerns, have raised concerns about this. And your comment about does this create conservation concerns or does it make sense? The issue is that all stocks from the 4 stock groupings are allocated out in the management process. So if somebody is taking another part of them, it needs to be considered. So if you have a process and you understand what you want to do and having those fish, whether it's in Heiltsuk territory or in some other place, but the management approach that was in play in 2010 and that we're working on right now for 2011 is trying to bring into account all of those different stocks, conservation issues, allocation. Those fish need to go to a variety of places. Mr. Shepherd has raised some of the concerns around some specific populations over and above Early Stewart that are part of some of these more difficult kinds of discussions. So those are a couple of them, and I believe the Shuswap also raised concerns about how these decisions will be made into the future.
Okay, so Mr. Rosenberger, I didn't understand you properly then. So it wasn't that they were opposed to Heiltsuk in particular and Heiltsuk's situation last year in 2010 when there was such a strong run. Is that correct? These concerns that you're raising, these are more general discussions about the policy itself.
Some of the concerns raised, and maybe Mr. Shepherd should speak for his concerns in there, but not all populations. When you look at the Fraser, it's not one stock. There's a large number.
I'm sorry, Mr. Rosenberger, but we're so confined in time. Could you just answer my question? It wasn't directed at the Heiltsuk, was it, in 2010? Those objections?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'll give you an opportunity to, if there's sufficient time, those who frown from Commission Council there, if there's sufficient time to come back to that. Thank you. Mr. Wilson, does the DFO consult with Heiltsuk on their FSC fishery?
No.
Okay, does Heiltsuk take the position that the DFO must consult on the FSC fishery?
That's correct.
And on what basis does Heiltsuk take that position?
Well, for our needs.
Okay, so your AFS agreement sets out 20,000 sockeye pieces. Where did that number come from?
I'm not sure. It was going through all the old documents. It was created in the beginning. I don't know where the number came from.
Okay, you were at Hermd last year when the AFS agreement was negotiated, correct?
Yes.
And you're there now as it's being negotiated, right?
Yes.
So where's that 20,000 pieces coming from? What's DFO telling you what that number is coming from?
Well, they're not telling us where that's coming from. It's just within past agreements.
Have you asked where that number, how that number's arrived at?
Yes, I have. Quite a few years ago, there was a discussion around 2% of the total allowable catch is what the FSC numbers are. And I've asked repeatedly a number of DFO staff members where this formula had come from. And there hasn't been any documentation provided.
Okay, so apart from the 2010 incident last year, has Heiltsuk asked for an increase in FSC during the fishing season?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us when that was and what happened?
Well, after last year, we met, had a phone call with Kristen Wong, our resource manager. If the numbers for the Fraser River sockeye was going to be just as large, we were going to request an additional 5,000 pieces.
Okay, and what happened to that request?
She replied in an email identifying the requirements of such a request.
Okay, Mr. Lund, could you please pull up Heiltsuk 96? Mr. Wilson, now you've looked at this document. Is this the email you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, so I've read this and I'm going to be the devil's advocate. Why isn't this consultation?
Well, if you look at the Canada's best practices for consultation and accommodation, it's only one stage of that process. I think it's a six-step stage.
Okay, and let me be the devil's advocate again. If this is only one stage, then, you know, how can you be sure it's not going to proceed through the other 5 steps?
In our experiences with the department, it proceeds to a certain level, and then they just provide their position.
Okay, you say it proceeds to a certain level. What do you mean by that? What happens?
Well, if you look at the email that we're talking about, that would be the first stage. But it's not complete because we would need more detail as to a response in a formal letter, details as to what's the stock going to be this year.
Are there any other steps which you say that DFO doesn't typically make out?
If you look at the actual best practices agreement, you look at from page 9 on to page 11.
Mr. Lunn, if you could pull that up for us, it's Exhibit 596. And I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, what pages are you at?
Page 9.
Please continue.
First step, the inform First Nations of intent to consult. The second step, information exchange, initial meeting. The third step, bilateral discussions or follow-up meetings. The fourth step, First Nations response to DFO. Fifth step, DFO response to First Nations. And step 6, issue resolutions and accommodations.
Okay, Mr. Wilson, but what are you saying that DFO aren't doing?
Well, it's been specific to that email. If we get to step 1, provide sufficient information so that First Nations can decide whether or not to participate in the consultation process. So if we look at the requirements in that email, it basically gives me an outline of what I would need to provide their office the process to review. But that email doesn't give me the information that I would require. If this year's stocks were in conservation, we wouldn't be engaging in this process.
Okay, so what about, I'm looking ahead at step 5. Step 5 towards the end, if there's, where DFO would provide a written response to concerns raised during the consultative process. Is this generally a step that occurs?
No. No, it doesn't.
Do you generally receive anything from DFO?
No, none.
Okay, now I'm just going to turn quickly to the IFMP. Does HELTSA consider that it's been consulted in relation to the IFMP?
To a certain stage it is, but after that it isn't.
Okay, and what stage is that?
Well, it's the information process. And then I've attended IFMP meetings where we would table our position and that we would not receive a reply from our position.
And is that a common experience through
Yes,
the
it is.
years?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I'm just going to move quickly joint management here. Does HELTIC subscribe to the concept of jointly managing the fisheries with Canada?
Yes.
Can you tell me of one example you would consider to be successful joint management?
Well, the HELTSIC have signed a management agreement with the Parks BC. It's called the Hakai-Luch Police Conservancy Area. The creation of that agreement formed a board which the HELTSIC have 50% representation. That to me is a form of joint management.
And what happens when there are disagreements at that table, given that it's a 50-50?
We haven't had that to date, but we basically sit down and compromise on the issues on the table. And we also don't, the other part of that is within the agreement, we can't veto the minister, so he would have final say.
So the minister would have veto, is what you're saying?
Yes.
And that's okay with HELTSIC?
We signed the agreement.
Now, in relation to joint management, do you have any recommendations as to fisheries enforcement in HELTSIC territory?
A number of them. We have guardians who have been involved in this process for quite a few years. They don't have a standard training process, so they're not recognized as having a qualified training program. There's also, we're looking for authority. We want to be able to say that we're owners, and as owners we want to be able to manage the resources in our territory. We need resources to be able to do this.
Mr. Wilson, I'm just going to move to the Tier 1 process. Now, the DFO have commented on the problem of not having one person or group to talk on behalf of multiple nations. Is that your experience?
No, it isn't.
Can you give us a good example of working together?
Well, I refer back to the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, the membership of the Central Coast nations. Those nations are engaged in a marine use planning process, and we've each individual band has created their own marine use plan. But up to last year, we've had their own individual plans. Now we have a harmonized marine use plan for the Central Coast.
What document number is this? 98. Mr. Ludden, could you please pull up document 98? Mr. Lunn, if you could please go to page 4. This is the Central Coast First Nations Marine Use Plan Executive Summary. Do you recognize that, Mr. Wilson?
Yes.
Okay, and at page 4, there's a description of the nations that are involved in this marine use plan. Paragraph 3, it provides us a harmonized reflection of the goals, objectives, and strategies of Heiltsuk, Kitasoo, Newhalk, and Awikino nations. Do you see that?
Yes.
So does that mean that these 4 nations are harmonized when it comes to this particular plan?
Yes.
Okay, and if we can flip quickly to page 8. In that first paragraph there's an indication that there's an expectation with this group that it will work with government, neighboring communities, and industry to address these issues. Is that indeed part of the plan for these 4 nations?
Yes, it is.
Okay, now to page 26. Okay. And Mr. Lynn, if you can take us down to the chart. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, there are, I see, Mr. Wilson, rows which set out activities and then a column which sets out marine activities. My understanding is that this shows activities are allowed in the marine area that all 4 nations are in agreement with. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so then dealing with this issue of, well, First Nations, they can't agree between themselves or work things out. One of the controversial issues, of course, is aquaculture. Can you explain to me what has happened in terms of how to deal with this difficult issue of aquaculture between 4 nations, when we all know here in this room that one of those 4 nations is pro finfish salmon farming and the others are not?
Well, one is pro, one is dead is set against it, and 2 are interested in land-based systems. But when we're at the table, we respect each other's positions, and there's compromise at the table. But if there was a position that the 4 nations couldn't agree to it, it would not be within this marine use plan process. But in saying that, if the one First Nation who wanted to establish a new site, it would have to establish that site within its own marine use plan, which allowed aquaculture.
And that was a point that was agreed to.
Yes.
With all 4 nations. Is that correct?
Yes.
As part of this marine use plan.
Yes.
Mr. Wilson, do you have any recommendations when it comes to AFS agreements or IFMP agreements?
Other than following the best practices as identified in a document?
Yes. Okay, let me move to the absolute last question, I promise here, which is simply, so in your view, why has DFO failed to consult or successfully engage in joint management with Heiltsuk?
Why have they failed?
Mm-hmm.
Trust. They think that we can't compromise. They think we can't work together as First Nations. I think there's a number of issues, but those are the 3 big ones.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Ms. Fung, did you want your last 2 documents marked?
Yes, please.
Yes. Tab 96 will be marked as 1,268. Tab 98 will be 1,269.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure there's anything that Mr. East can usefully accomplish with 2 minutes left. Perhaps we should adjourn, and I understand it's 10:30 tomorrow morning.
Hearing is now adjourned until 10:30 tomorrow morning.
Oh,